أعوذ بالله السميع العليم من الشيطان اللعين الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. Welcome to the what is most likely the penultimate session devoted to Julius Evola and his thought. We are discussing some very interesting essays today from his anthology, The Bow and the Club. And what we'll do is we'll look at the myth and fallacy of irrationalism, which is the 7th chapter or essay in this collection. And then we will move to the taste for vulgarity. And then, depending on time, maybe we'll either do what tradition is, which is the last one, or subliminal influences, intelligent and intelligent stupidity, seeing, according to how things progress today. So I think that in many ways, the modern world may be characterized, and it indeed proclaims itself as, or it certainly did in the earlier part of the 20th century, and for a good part of the 20th century, the age of reason. And reason, of course, also has in mind the concepts of rationality, of science, and of course technology, and that rationalism and scientism are really the only ways toward achieving any genuine knowledge about the world and ourselves. And so there is a particular understanding of the irrational, a peculiar understanding of the irrational. And not only this, but there were also reactions, very strong reactions to this notion of rationality, and various forms of irrationality emerged. Evola singles out in particular as forms of irrationality, existentialism, and psychoanalysis. So in this essay, he wants to really examine what is meant by irrationality, but at the same time, he wants to look at rationality itself. And if I may put it this way, he also wishes to go beyond the dichotomy between the rational and the irrational, to go backwards in this essay, an effort to kind of reverse the regressive tendencies of the Kali Yuga within one's self through an inquiry of this kind, through understanding or arriving at a better understanding of what primordial man and primordial times were like. So let's jump right in. The myth and fallacy of irrationalism on page 66. Whereas the worship of reason was the hallmark of the previous age, the present times are certainly marked by a multifaceted irrationalism. So on the one hand, you have this concept of rationality, of science, but at the same time, you have this dimension of irrationality as well, and he'll explain what he means by this. The emphasis has shifted onto what seems to be irreducible to ratio and the intellect. Oh my. Very sorry about that. I thought I had my phone off. And I really think he has in mind existentialism here, which he deals with at length in his book, Ride the Tiger, a survival manual for the aristocrats of the soul. So existentialism is an important part of this book. In fact, part 3 of 8 is devoted to what he calls the dead end of existentialism. So he's concerned with these forms of dissolution there as well. A mystique of life has been proclaimed, of the vital impulse and of pure immanence. Direct experience, sheer existence, and action in all their forms have come to be promoted. This is all existentialism. In opposition to the alleged sovereignty of clear thought, primacy has been affirmed for everything within the very depths of the human being, which cannot be traced back to thought. And of course, on the next page, he mentions Spengler, and then he mentions what a person who for me is an obscure thinker. I've never heard of him except here, Ludwig Klages. You can read the footnote. But on the next page, on 67, he immediately mentions existentialism. Existentialism toes the same line when it proclaims the primacy of existence over essence. And that's a very peculiar existentialism, as opposed to essentialism as a philosophical position. It's a very strange one, because he's not talking about things as such. He's talking about the human being in particular, and that for the human being's existence precedes his essence, whereas in everything else, it is essence that precedes the existence of those things. So in things other than human beings, essentialism reigns supreme. This is at least the understanding of Jean-Paul Sartre. And there's a footnote about Sartre. He gives the example. He has a famous text essay called "Existentialism is a Humanism." Then he goes on to, of course, mention psychoanalysis. It is moreover obvious that psychoanalysis essentially adopts the same general orientation. Its hallmark is the emphasizing and promoting of what it regards as being primary by virtue of its belonging to the obscure realm of the unconscious and the preconscious, in which the real driving force of one's being is believed to reside. So again, Evola is a masterful diagnostician of the degenerative processes of the Kali Yuga. And here, as peculiar examples of an ascendant irrationalism, he identifies existentialism and psychoanalysis. And of course, psychoanalysis is that which is associated with Freud. There's another famous trend in psychology, of course, that of Jung, and he includes Jungian psychology here as well, because one particular example that the modern world likes to give of irrationalism is myth. And of course, Jung was very much concerned with myth and something called the collective unconscious. So here he says, as a consequence of all this, recent years have witnessed a renewed interest in the world of myths and symbols, which is seen as the expression of a primary psychovital substrate irreducible to reason. A particular place should be assigned within this framework to C.G. Jung, that's Carl Gustav Jung's theory of the so-called archetypes. Now, Jung's concept of archetypes is considered by Evola to be a distortion. In fact, he calls it an irrationalist contamination of a concept which is originally from ancient metaphysics. So the realm of the archetypes, really the Platonic forms or the Platonic ideas, is part of the intelligible or noetic world known as the cosmos noetos, I think is the Greek. And indeed, you find echoes and adaptations of the ancient Greek notion, the Platonic doctrine of ideas or forms, in the Islamic world as well, in Islamic philosophy, especially with the teachings of Muhyiddin ibn al-Arabi, who speaks of what are called the fixed entities, or al-a'yan al-thabita in Arabic. And these are very similar to the Platonic ideas or forms. So having identified these particular examples of, or singled out these as examples of a particularly or peculiarly ascendant irrationalism of the modern period, it's ascending, it's coming to the fore, but it's actually dragging everything down. He then in the next page, page 68, exactly explains what the goal of this essay is supposed to be. He says, in several respects, the polemical character of modern irrationalism, which verges on aggressiveness, is quite clear. It expresses a revolt against the kind of rationality that in the bourgeois age had been conceived as an ordering principle, as a symbol of progress with respect to the previous periods, and even as a guarantee of safety for collective living, since rationality was expected to eliminate all that is arbitrary, accidental, and impulsive. In particular, irrationalism rejects the mechanized and soulless view of the world, which has acted as a fatal counterpart to all the material achievements of modern man. So on the face of it, it may not just be a bad thing to react against this kind of cold and soulless rationalism, but he goes on, he says, the polemical character of irrationalism in itself suggests we should be distrustful of any phenomenon that constitutes a mere reaction. So he doesn't advocate a kind of unintelligent reactionism. He says, for reactions to one unbalance almost inevitably end up replacing it with another. For reactions to one unbalance almost inevitably end up replacing it with another without ever attaining anything truly positive. It would be appropriate, therefore, to consider the relations between the rational and the irrational. So the rest of the essay is devoted to exactly explaining what is rational, what is irrational, what lies beyond them. He also has a lot to say about the nature of myth properly understood and how all of this relates to the time before the Kali Yuga, this primordial age. So the first problem is that to posit a dichotomy between rationalism and irrationalism is itself an error and is a further manifestation of the regressive tendencies of the Kali Yuga, the regression of the castes, etc. And the reason for this is that rationalism and irrationalism both fall prey to what he calls an identical fallacy, namely that both irrationalism and rationalism maintain that the sphere of abstract thought has an independent existence. And thus, according to Evola, the irrational is set in contrast to the rational, and life or existence or instinct or the unconscious to the intellect. And it seems as though people are incapable of envisaging anything above and beyond these limiting oppositions. So it's a false dichotomy. All of this, according to Evola, is an attestation of the drop in level, the regression that has taken place. You know, again, think of descent and skiing. So for Evola, he is of the view that this dichotomy is a false one, and it is necessary, therefore, on the contrary, as he says, to hold that both reason, together with all the various forms of modern intellectualistic consciousness, you know, all forms of rationalism, and its irrationalist counterpart do not constitute anything primary, but are rather the products of a disassociation, interconnected products that lack an independent existence. Their opposition is only true from a certain point of view, and only if we accept the assumption that they are dissociated from reality, from a reality higher than and anterior with an A to either of them. So this unity, anterior and higher to either rationalism or irrationalism, is for Evola what he calls the true center of the human being in his normal state. And again, normal, he says, in a higher sense. it does not at all fall within some twilight zone which can be reached by approaching point zero in one's personal consciousness, as Jung suggests when he speaks of the so-called individuation process, or the only sphere where the dubious union between one's consciousness and the collective unconsciousness can occur. So this is a very, very important point. Now, there is a view that, especially you find this when you study ancient Greek philosophy, when you take a typical introductory course on ancient Greek philosophy, typically the official dogma or the received wisdom, the prevailing wisdom is that when philosophy emerged in ancient Greece, it was a turning away from a kind of mythopoetic consciousness or a mythopoetic understanding of things to a more rational and scientific understanding of things. And this is what he's alluding to here when he says that there's a certain philosophy of civilization according to which the domain of clear thought was pervaded in primordial times by an imaginative activity, an activity which created myths and emotionally charged images. Only in a subsequent period, subsequent in a historical and chronological sense for some people, but in an ideal sense for others, did an intellectual consciousness differentiate itself by emerging out of the haze of the mythical experience and grasping the clear and stark forms of concepts essentially as philosophy knows them. So according to Evola Spengler, Oswald Spengler in The Decline of the West has a similar view, but again, Evola is against all of this. He is against this kind of interpretation of the past. Such an intellectual history is fundamentally flawed. These theories, Evola says, these theories too are based on a fundamental misunderstanding of reality. They are digressions of an arbitrary speculative thought that ignores the central experience of traditional man, who ought to be regarded as the true, normal human being. So naturally, the historians, intellectual historians, and classicists, they interpret this rationalistic human being as the normal human being. But Evola is saying, no, traditional man is the true normative human being or normal human being. And there was no dichotomy of this kind. He says, in primordial times, there existed an essentially spiritual and supra-rational ideal of knowledge, which we might call the ideal of metaphysical clarity. This played a central role, particularly in the cycle of all higher Indo-European societies. In the ancient world, it is reflected by everything which was identified with or adumbrated by the symbolism of light, of celestial brightness, of the regions and entities of a higher realm. Remember his fascination with mountains and the symbolism of mountains, and then how he extends this to a kind of spiritual interpretation of mountaineering. So Evola is pointing here to what he calls an Olympian nucleus, corresponding to what is actually the primordial element of all higher ancient civilizations, of their mythologies, and to some extent even of their institutions. Now, he calls attention to two very important terms from ancient Greek civilization: logos and nous. And logos and nous, he says, can only inadequately be translated as reason and intellect in the modern sense. So already in the modern period, terms like logos and nous have been misunderstood. Originally, essentially, according to Evola, terms such as logos and nous point to the metaphysical domain, whereas their intellectualistic meaning, not intellectual meaning, but intellectualistic meaning. Obviously, he's referring to their interpretation in the modern world. So whereas their intellectualistic meaning belongs to a relatively recent period and must be regarded as sort of reflection or transposition. So it's extremely important to keep in mind the ancient Greek conception of what is called the kosmos noetos, the intelligible or intellectual world, the world of the archetypes, not in the Jungian sense, but in their genuine traditional sense with a capital T. This intelligible aspect, the intelligible world of the cosmos noetos, is connected to the ontological world, or to the ontological aspect, and to the metaphysical aspect within what he calls a fundamental unitary experience. This fundamental unitary experience lies beyond the opposition of rationality and irrationality. And so if you understand things this way, the earlier understanding of things, that which is pejoratively referred to as a mythic understanding or a mythic view or a mythopoetic worldview, was in fact better, was in fact more fundamental, was related to this cosmos noetos, to this ontological and metaphysical aspect. So for Evola, myths and symbols have an essentially intelligible content. They are not to be seen as a kind of emotional outbursts or effusions of a primitive mind. What we have, Evola says, instead are meanings, when speaking of myth and symbols, what we have instead are meanings of a higher and objective sort, extensions of a genuine super consciousnness soaring within a space beyond history in the world of principles, or archai. Archai is, that's where you get the word archetype, the arche, the ARCHE. And there's a footnote here. So the arche is the origin or the beginning of a thing, in the sense of it being its principle. That's the essence of footnote number 8. So on this level, that is to say, on this level of the super consciousness, and this is what really Evola is interested in, not the Freudian subconscious or the Jungian unconscious or subconscious. On the level of this genuine super consciousness that soars above, on this level, he says, the action of the intellect coincided and was consubstantial with the action of being in a real sense, and not as in certain modern theories of knowledge which lack any confirmation in actual experience. In other words, the person who is on the level of super consciousness, the intellection for such a person is a unification. It is an act of being. It is a true unification of the knower and the thing known. So in the light of all this, Evola says that myths and symbols exercised a special power, and they also manifested themselves as forces that carried the soul and integrated all the various functions of the human being. What this means, he says further, is that myths and symbols also contain that power, that potential, which is attributed to the irrational. Aha. Very interesting observation. It was therefore a kind of experience that grasped whatever manifested itself to the senses according to a higher meaning and in an intelligible light. This experience was not a hazy, mystical one, but rather an action in the higher sense, which essentially entailed the destruction, the burning out of all that is infrasensible. In other words, everything that's below the level of the senses and unconscious. So this is the essential nucleus of superconsciousness. It is suffused, according to Evola, by the light of the metaphysical and the primordial. Now, this is very difficult for modern people to grasp, and he knows this. He says, I realize that many readers will find it difficult to grasp all this, since we are dealing with perspectives that have long been lost and which are foreign to today's culture. Yet, these references are essential for finding one's bearings, as well as for grasping the true meaning of contemporary irrationalism. So, it is fundamental for the Evolian project of riding the tiger, of surviving the Kali Yuga, to understand these degenerative and regressive forces. And so it is extremely important in this project, in order to find one's bearings amidst all of this irrationality and rationality and the false dichotomy between the two, to truly understand what is meant by contemporary irrationalism. So when we come to the history of civilizations, which is dominant today, he says that the theory of a mythical era, quote unquote, mythical era, irrationally conceived as lying in a primordial time, is absolutely wrong. However, he says, one must acknowledge that in certain stages or periods of an ancient civilization, what is ideally secondary in practice occasionally acquired a primary role, in such a way that myths were mostly experienced in terms of their imaginative, emotional, and subrational aspect. So already there is, even in primordial times, the seeds of destruction, the seeds of decay and degeneration. In as much as sometimes myths and symbols were seen in a way that stressed their imaginative, emotional, and non-rational, or I think actually he says sub-rational. Yeah, he says sub-rational aspect. In such cases, Evola is of the view, in such cases, he says, we find a degeneration of the original form, of an experience and of a kind of knowledge that preserved their genuine and normal character only among certain closed elites. So here he speaks a little bit about primitive peoples, and he is of the view, as is Genon, that so-called primitive peoples, he's especially excuse me, primitive peoples is often is understood by Genon and Evola to refer to what may be characterized as these aboriginal kinds of peoples that you find maybe in living in virgin nature, most of the with a very minimum kind of a high civilization or culture. There's no sort of monumental architecture, just sort of a hunter-gatherer existence. And quite in contrast to modern anthropologists, and especially in the early days of anthropology and ethnography, where there was the concept of the noble savage, and that somehow these people were living in a state of nature before the emergence of an overarching concept of a social contract and a state and all of this. So Evola is of the view that no, these, as is Genon, that these are actually examples of the twilight of more advanced civilizations, and represented a degeneration of some kind of higher civilizations which had existed in previous yugas. So the same applies to the world of primitive peoples, he says, who for the most part are but the degenerated and twilight remnants of very ancient extinct cultures, just as the higher type of the sage and initiate has been replaced among them by the witch doctor, medicine man, and so on. And this results in what he calls a nocturnal consciousness, in which there are psychic and magical corpses of symbols and myths of these people, their ghosts, so to speak. And these all exist in the form of dynamic complexes, which, having lost their luminous and intelligible spiritual nucleus, produce what he terms dark ecstasies. So these are residues, and cannot really be seen as forms of higher civilization from the primordial age. So what exactly was the nature of this descent from a unitary super consciousness in which there wasn't any genuine dichotomy between the rational and the irrational, myth and reason? So he identifies a couple of stages in this process of descent and degeneration. At the origin, he says there lies what Evola returns to on many occasions, what he calls the Olympian ideal of suprasensible light, the realm of higher supra-rational knowledge. As is well known, comparative philology has identified this in the very names sprung from the same root and connected to the idea of luminosity that the various higher civilizations of Indo-European origin used to describe the deity. So words such as Diaus, Deus, Zeus, Theus, and so on. And he says that there are parallels in other cultural areas. And he mentions, by way of example, the Chinese term Tian and the great luminous Yang, Y-A-N-G. So we may trace back to this stage the highest object of knowledge, namely the metaphysical content of myths and symbols. So myths and symbols are, for the radical traditionalist, better than mere modern reason or unreason, better than modern rationality or irrationality. So that's the first stage, the origin, the Olympian ideal, where Uranian civilization and Aryan civilization dominates and understands things in this way of suprasensible light and supraconsciousness. The second, or the next stage, is distinguished by the fact that the mythical form of this content becomes more prominent. So there's an imbalance and partly independent. This is the point at which the various mythological personifications emerge, whose inner meaning or intelligible content grows dimmer and dimmer, transforming into a merely religious, mythologizing, or even aestheticizing experience, as we can see in the phases of decline in Greece and Rome. He further makes the observation in passing. Let us note in passing that it is in relation to these subproducts that the conception of symbols and myths emerge as arbitrary and unreal imaginative forms, a conception which long remained dominant in contemporary culture. So the turning point, according to Evola, for Western civilization in this descent comes about when those aspects of Greek thought in which given conceptions, starting from that of the intelligible world or the cosmos noetos, and of principles conceived as metaphysical realities or archai, lost their meaning as symbols pertaining to sacred knowledge. And this is something that's there very early on. You find in ancient Greek philosophy, early ancient Greek philosophy, you find in Plato as well, the people talk about these myths and they don't really understand what they mean. And they find a lot of these myths to be quite silly. And Evola notes this. He says that so the turning point is when the notion of the intelligible world and principles conceived of as metaphysical realities, they'll lose their meaning as symbols pertaining to sacred knowledge and became speculative conceptual constructs. This ambiguity is already to be found in Plato and was only partly overcome by the Neoplatonists. The same process later occurred with medieval scholasticism. This is really interesting. So medieval scholasticism is not as bad as modern thought, but there are still issues with medieval scholasticism for Evola. So the same process later occurred with medieval scholasticism, whose rationalism used a system of more or less sterile concepts to express the content of a supra-rational experience that lay behind the various representations and hypostases of theology. So scholasticism is, of course, very much built up on Aristotle. And so he sees Aristotelianism as a kind of a step down from Platonism and Neoplatonism, and Platonism itself is a kind of step down from the original Olympian ideal of suprasensible light. So continuing in this direction, he says, we approach actual rationalism. The traditional ideal of suprasensible clarity gives way to that of natural light and of rational evidence. A tendency takes root to conceive reason as an independent faculty capable of drawing from within itself the principles required to ensure certainty in the sphere of knowledge, a code of conduct in the practical domain, and order in the social and political field. So you have pure and practical reason of Kant. And I think it's interesting to note that René Guénon also talks about rationalism in this way in The Crisis of the Modern World. I think it's on page, if you refer to this edition of The Crisis of the Modern World, on page 57. It's in a chapter 5 entitled Individualism. He says, as we are speaking of philosophy, we shall mention some of the consequences of individualism in this field, though without entering into every detail. First of all, there was the negation of intellectual intuition. I think this is very similar, or if not identical, to exactly what Evola has just been talking about, and the consequent raising of reason above all else. This purely human and relative faculty being treated as the highest part of the intelligence, or even as coinciding with the whole of the intelligence. This is what constitutes rationalism, whose real founder was Descartes. This limitation of intelligence was, however, only a first stage. Before long, reason itself was increasingly relegated to mainly practical functions, in proportion as applications began to predominate over such sciences as might still have kept a certain speculative character, and Descartes himself was already at heart much more concerned with these practical applications than with pure science. That's sufficient to make my point, namely that Evola is very much indebted to Guénon, and indeed the two men and their writings complement one another. So returning to Evola on page 76. So what happens after Descartes? So these further developments, these post-Cartesian developments, proceed in three general directions, according to Evola. So the first refers to speculative and dialectic abstractions. The second is a further degradation of the intellect. And the third is in the direction of what he calls the Enlightenment and its offshoot. So let's see what he means. With regard to subsequent developments, three general directions may be distinguished. The first is that of speculative and dialectic abstractions, which are more and more removed, both from the spirit and from concrete reality. This direction corresponds to the domain of modern philosophy. So modern philosophy is characterized not by intellectual intuition, not by superconsciousness, this consciousness of the Olympian ideal, this direct witnessing or vision of the cosmos noetos, but merely consists of conceptual elaborations, and I would even say a great degree of hair splitting and logic chopping, the kind of full immersion to the point of drowning in mere abstractions and illusions of the mind itself, just being lost and being bewitched by the power of philosophical terms, which have just been invented almost out of nothing. The second direction, according to Evola, is marked by the degrading of the intellect through its increasingly practical and pragmatist use, reducing it to a means of acquiring positive scientific knowledge and to its various applications through the mathematization and coordination of data from sensible experience, as well as through technical and technological organization. All right. So what's the third? So the first was obviously speculative dialectic in modern philosophy. Then the practical application of reason in scientific investigation. And the third is in the direction of what is known as the Enlightenment and its offshoots, such as modern critical thought. This is the aggressive direction, writes Evola, whereby intellectualistic thought, in cahoots with individualism. We already noted that Genon has a whole chapter on individualism, chapter 5 in the Crisis of the Modern World. So in cahoots with individualism and all the various revolutionary and anti-traditional movements, often including scientism itself, has come to serve as an instrument for the destruction or desacralization of existence, presented as the liberation of man and the human spirit from obscurantism. So enlightenment, what is called the Enlightenment, is in point of fact a corruption of the true nature of enlightenment, and is in fact nothing and none other than an instrument for the destruction and the desacralization of the world. Now, here he wants to dwell a bit on the corruption of this term enlightenment. And he has written about this. He says, and it mentions elsewhere, and then there's a footnote, namely his book, The Mystery of the Grail, which came out in 1938. Here it says, I think that's section 29, chapter 29. So in that book, he says, I noted how it was originally related to a range of ideas analogous to those just outlined. It was neither a philosophy nor a social ideology. So enlightenment and the enlightened ones originally were those who had received spiritual enlightenment, enabling them to participate of a kind of knowledge that transcended ordinary human faculties. Again, this Olympian ideal, super consciousness. One may refer here to what scholasticism describes as intuitio intellectualis, or intellectual intuition, and what Hinduism calls vidya, and what Buddhism calls prajna or bodhi, and so on. There's lots of other terms. By its very nature, enlightenment in this sense, or this form of experience, as he says, can only be the prerogative of a few elect. In other words, an intellectual elite. An intellectual is not in the modern sense of intellectual. It is evident, therefore, that the doctrine of enlightenment found its rightful place exclusively within a hierarchical and aristocratic and hence traditional framework. So again, we have here an allusion to the regression of castes, the regression of the castes in the Kali Yuga. So as he rounds out the chapter, he wants to talk a bit about dogma in religions, particularly a religion like Catholicism, because in religions of this kind, religious dogma is analogous to myth. In the sense that in a dogma, whatever intelligible content there is just given directly, it's just stated as such. In other words, it's presented not as the object of investigation or of true knowledge, but of faith, typically in the form of a revelation, or a dogma may be just a restatement of a text which is taken to be revelation in the religion in question. And so it's based on an authority which places it beyond any criticism or discussion. Now, this is a peculiar situation for Evola. And so because he upholds the concept of tradition, with a capital T, and therefore would not really be against religion per se, he has to explain this. He says here on page 78, the peculiar situation that led to dogmatic forms at the end of antiquity in the West is to be found in a certain spiritual degradation of the most recent European man. His marked propensity towards individualism and intellectual anarchy. From a given historical period onwards, certain forms of knowledge came to exceed the intellectual limits of the average person. So the only way to safeguard them against profane attacks was to present them in the form of dogmas. Here, he approvingly quotes Guénon. He says, René Guénon rightly observes, quotation, there are people who, in order not to divagate, in other words, to go astray, in the etymological sense of the word, need to be kept under strict supervision, while there are others who have no such need. Dogma is necessary for the first and not for the second, just as, to take another example of a slightly different kind, the forbidding of images is necessary only for people who naturally tend towards a kind of anthropomorphism in conceiving the sacred. End of quote. That's from Guénon's book, Initiation and Spiritual Realization, translated by Henry D. Ford, Sophia Prentice, Hillsdale, New York, 2001, page 90. So that is why dogma comes about. And when it's explained like this, you understand how it relates to myth. In other words, there is an irrational element in the sense that reason is an exercise, reason is put aside, intellectual intuition is also put aside and is replaced by faith. So even though this is still part of some traditions with a small t that come under tradition with a capital T, Evola does not see this as the best possibility for a human being, in as much as he recognizes, again, a hierarchy of human beings, and the higher Uranian or Olympian or Kshatriya type person, human type, is someone who is not on the level of dogma and need of faith. That person is free, and because that person knows, and because they know, they are free. And that is how illumination and enlightenment has to be properly understood. Evola says further on, anyone who knows something by having directly experienced it has no need to believe. He knows and is free. He will find himself beyond dogma, not against dogma. So in it might be interesting to mention just in passing that in Sufism, in the Islamic tradition, an initiate who has attained to this Olympian ideal, although we don't use that terminology, that's Evola's terminology, but that individual who has attained to this high degree of initiatic realization is referred to as a knower. The Arabic term is arif, and that state is simply called knowledge. The Arabic word is irfan, but irfan is a sort of a special word in Arabic, and typically in English it's translated by the English word of Greek etymology, namely gnosis, gnosis, Gnosis. But if you really look into the etymology of things, knowledge is actually knowledge, right? Knowledg, from kno, to know. So they ultimately go back to the same root, and it's the same in Sanskrit. The highest yoga is jnana yoga. In Sanskrit, the term jnana or jnana yoga refers to the highest form of yoga, or attunement, if you like, with the principle, with the capital P, as explained in the Bhagavad Gita. And that was only supposed to be said in passing, but we sort of got going a little bit there. So let's get back to what we were talking about. So we also find in the modern age, don't we, in the modern period, this kind of tendency by modern so-called intellectuals, and we use now the term intellectual in its modern sense, in the sense that Edward Said was an intellectual, or Noam Chomsky is an intellectual, or Leo Strauss is an intellectual. Very different sorts of people, but all of them would be characterized as intellectuals in some way or another. Particularly academics, educated people in the modern age, they typically, in modern education, moves toward this idea of critical thinking for yourself, going against received dogmas. So how does Evola see that tendency? He says on midway, about a third of the way down on page 79, by contrast, a very serious perversion occurs. By contrast, a very serious perversion occurs when the need to go beyond dogma is affirmed on the basis of reason, a faculty that is merely human, and hence incapable on its own of soaring towards anything transcendent. Okay. This is also the case when the possibility of going beyond dogma is extended to just anyone. So this is going beyond dogma is a prerogative only of those people who are of the right caste, those people who are or those human types which are sufficiently integrated to be able to surpass dogma. So this is also the case when the possibility of going beyond dogma is extended to just anyone. It is at this stage that the dam breaks, and that quote unquote enlightenment becomes a distinguishing feature of quote unquote, so-called free thinkers, through a rationalist and critical thought which establishes itself as the ultimate judge in a domain governed inevitably by individualism, the very thing which tradition in specific circumstances has sought to prevent by taking on dogmatic forms. Such is the origin of the current yet distorted meaning acquired by the word enlightenment in the history of ideas. So, concluding thoughts by Evola on this myth and fallacy of irrationalism. He says, after coming away from this digression about enlightenment, he says, the accentuation, this is page 80, the accentuation and predominance of the secularized intellect, of rationalism, and of the other aforementioned abstract or technical and practical tendencies of Western thought were ultimately destined to lead to an insurrection of all the forces of an existence that had been detached from any higher point of reference. So once things become detached from the Olympian ideal, once there is a regression of the caste, so there's no one to uphold that Olympian ideal, once myth is disconnected from reason and reason is disconnected from myth, enlightenment is completely distorted and misunderstood. When all of this happens, forces which could no longer be contained by rational schemes, such as dogma, for example, and which had previously been disregarded and suppressed. But this is where the misunderstanding arose. Having lost all sense of that reality before which rationality represents only an unreal reflection and surrogate, people have turned not to the super-rational, but to the sub-rational. That explains a lot about psychoanalysis. So they've turned to the sub-rational in search of what the intellect can no longer provide, insofar as this intellect has become synonymous with reasoning. Here he approvingly quotes Guénon once again. René Guénon is perfectly right in noting that after the rationalism, materialism, and positivism of the last century have led individuals to shut themselves off from what lies above man, and it is here that the contribution made by the distorted enlightenment is to be found, these new currents are now opening up man to everything which lies below him. It's interesting to note here, there's no footnote to this effect, but just from my own reading, I can say that Evola explores this in great detail in a book-length treatment as it applies to the corruption of spirituality in modern times. So he has a book called The Fall of Spirituality, in which he looks also at psychoanalysis, but modern forms of spiritualism, theosophy, anthroposophy of Rudolf Steiner, even Satanism, all sorts of modern forms of spiritualism, and how they represent more an opening to that which is beneath or what is below, the infra-human, the subconscious, rather than that which is above. So the final summation of this essay, he says, finally, it is worth mentioning the latest outcome of the irrationalist regression, namely the myth of the quote-unquote leading idea. Today, we find a type of man who regards principles as meaningless abstractions and who assigns value to ideas only insofar as they have the power as watchwords to elicit certain emotional states. I think this is also relates to the evasive man, that essay we read last time. What chapter was that? The Breed of the Evasive Man. It was the second one. So these emotional states, these meaningless abstractions and watchwords, this is exactly what many people today understand by the term myth. This myth, says Evola, is understood as a complex which cannot be accounted for in rational terms, and which must be evaluated not in terms of its objective content and truth, but rather on the basis of its power to operate as a center, crystallizing irrational and emotional forces, those of individuals and the masses. In relation to this action, a leading role is often played in an invisible and sinister way by the corpses of genuine ancient myths. One might also refer here to the Jungian archetypes. On this level, myths may also become conflated with the watchwords of politics, democracy, and demagogy. We thus witness a peculiar reversal. Ancient humanity has been accused of being mythical, which is to say of having lived and acted according to fanciful and imaginary complexes. However, the truth of the matter is that if there ever existed a mythical humanity in this negative sense of the term, It is certainly contemporary humanity. Those great words written with a capital letter: people, progress, humanity, society, freedom. He capitalizes all of those, and the many others that have spawned incredible mass movements. We can think of many modern examples, causing the most disastrous consequences, paralyzing all capacity for clear judgment and criticism in the individual. These words have the nature of myths. I would add further that these words, these terms, these watchwords, as he calls them, really have the character of magic, of fascination in the original linguistic sense of the term fascination, a kind of bewitchment, which overpowers people and takes hold of them, bewitches them, I would say even possesses them. And it is here that the role of the modern propagandist and the role of the witch or the sorcerer converge. There was a Romanian scholar of religion named Culianu, very mysterious figure. He was close to Eliade, Mircea Eliade, and he wrote about this phenomenon. He wrote a number of works. I can't recall exactly, but I have them nearby. We can hunt them down if you like in the Q&A. But he addressed this notion of how modern advertising is really akin to a form, really is a form of magic, no different from the forms of magic which we found in the European in medieval Europe. So from all of this, Evola says it should be clear then to the reader just how important it is to have an idea of the correct and central direction to be followed beyond the false antitheses produced by a process of dissociation. So even though we can't stop this trend, if we understand that this dichotomy between rationalism and irrationalism is a false one, and that there was something above and beyond this dichotomy, a kind of Olympian ideal, a super consciousness that predates the bifurcation of the mythopoetic vision and the rationalist vision, then he says it is possible to draw certain criteria of judgment and evaluation that may help one see more clearly so as to prevent confusion and deviations, ensuring a space open to possible influences that may orient one in the right direction. The ultimate aim, then, is a new drive towards that inner region where man can find his true, bright, and governing center. So modern man lacks a center for so many reasons. And he looks at one of those reasons and symptoms of the modern disease in this dichotomy between irrationalism and rationalism. So that's all I have to say about this essay. We can discuss this for a while. Now I'll open it up.
Yeah, I really thanks.
No
I
problem.
really like this essay, because irrationalism, that's a good term for like the more recent trend against a more recent trend in how to analyze like comparative religion of myths, like you said. And for a while I was interested in that kind of irrationalism just because I hadn't heard of it before. But then it does fall into the kind of flaw that Evola points out, which is the excessive psychologizing of an ancient mindset. And even though Jung is not as bad as what I'm going to say, some more modern people who take this approach too far, they will assume that that all the ancient people were of that kind of primitive mindset. So on one hand, you have people who say like they assume people are like Plato, who talk about the noble lie, like, oh, all myths are like a noble lie, and they take that's a huge leap that they feel comfortable making without much basis. And then they don't stop to think like, ancient people had the intelligence to not be convinced as easily, like you said, and like Evola pointed out, in compared to modern people, they're probably more credulous,
Yeah.
in terms of the things that motivate them to action. And so that's like one thing that I kind of realized after a while, that Evola, of course, pointed out way earlier. But another interesting thing is like how you mentioned briefly for a bit there, like, and I kind of want to, it's related to this, and I kind of want to ask also,
Sure.
in there's kind of an understanding in like, uh how do I put this, a way to kind of combine the views that is not too, that might be edging a little closer towards irrationalism. And the theory goes something like this: like, the original, well, there are some deities in Greek mythology that still have remnants of their kind of psychological basis, like in and then they usually point to like the Iliad, when the sons of Ares, which are war, are like Phobos and Deimos, which literally mean things like the, panic or fear and something like that. And then then at first, when I heard of this type of analysis, I was thinking, okay, so if if on that basis, then if certain deities are personifications of emotions or psychological forces, then are the more complex deities kind of this personification of a set of ideas. And then Evola is saying, no, that cannot be, that simple, that it's just a personification of an idea.
Mhm.
So I was thinking, like, are it's like, to what do those, well, I guess Ebola is saying like those more important deities refer to something bigger, and maybe those ones with that just have a psychologically based name, like fear, or persona, or something very simple like personified that way, or like victory, or like Nike, something like that. That's maybe a bit of a more, that's like an older remnant, like in like the chthonic gods, something like that. That kind
Mhm.
of
Mhm. Mhm.
another way to analyze things.
Yeah, I mean, it's very hard, I think, for modern people, and I would certainly include myself in this case here, to understand these ancient myths. I really find it very, very difficult to understand. Um Now I think that maybe that's because, okay, when I'm obviously, I'm born in the 20th century, and I wasn't raised in those traditions. But nowadays, who is anyone really raised as in ancient Greek religion? And it wasn't until much, much later that I realized that there's actually something deeper here. After I discovered Genon, um, and his writings, especially, he has this book on the symbols of sacred science, which he really opens up the world of symbolism and mythology. And there was, around the time I was in college, there was an explosion of interest in myth in America. But again, it was myth wrongly understood. So there was someone named Joseph Campbell. You may have heard of him.
Yeah, definitely. He's like, I think, one of the strongest figures of this kind of, not exactly irrationalism, but pretty close. Like, he's using it through a different, he's not psychologizing it as much as like Young, I guess.
Yeah,
Jung.
he's not psychologizing it, but at the same time, he's not a traditionalist. And he's looking for common themes. He has this book called the Hero with a Thousand Faces. He has a thing called The Power of Myth, and it became really famous in the U.S. because it became a TV, a kind of documentary series of interviews with him done by a guy named Bill Moyers. And I think that series and the book further perpetuated, the wrong kind of ideas about myth. And again, and I think that's also a manifestation of the powers that be, which are there to not to educate, but to miseducate. So because of all of that, I think I also went in the wrong direction. Then also, having grown up as a Muslim, especially from the Indian subcontinent originally, So there is a kind of, long history between Hindus and Muslims in India, but typically most Muslims today just think, Hindu mythology is just a bunch of complete nonsense and it doesn't make any sense at all. And by this, on the other side of the coin, so to speak, I don't think that the average Hindu person has any kind of deep, profound understanding of what these myths are. So the situation is very, very messy for this reason. And that's why I think this essay of Evola is so deep and profound. But without these kind of writings, for me, myth would have remained just a completely closed book. And I think also that there are many writings from the ancient world, maybe that have not been given much prominence. For example, things like commentaries he mentions this just as in a sentence, but there's a lot there. He talks about how myth was already, the beginnings of the bifurcation between myth and reason, or mythos and I guess it would be nous, wouldn't it? Or reason, if you use the Latin, it would be ratio, but that bifurcation was already very well established by the time of Plato. And he alludes to the fact that there was a kind of redress under under what he calls Neoplatonism, right? Well, there are a lot of ancient writings and commentaries on the works of Plato and Aristotle from later Platonism, which is known as Neoplatonism, but they've only recently started to be translated. And so there was even a kind of corruption of Plato and Aristotle, and there's a lot of positive, teaching there, very important and profound truths there, but they were also kind of recast by classicists. So there's a lot of muddying of the waters, and it's very hard to really sometimes figure things out, especially in terms of the ancient world in the Western world, but also ancient Egypt, these civilizations which are totally gone. And there is no, living link. I think in that regard, the situation is somewhat better in Hinduism and Buddhism, in as much as some sort of tradition continues to live. Although I think that the mythological dimension is much less in Buddhism. Of course, that also depends on which Buddhism, which land we're talking about. Perhaps the so-called mythological dimension is more prominent in Tibetan Buddhism than it would be in something like, let's say, Zen. But I think you understand my point, which simply is that I think in the Eastern traditions, like such as I said already, Hinduism, Buddhism, and then I would even say the Chinese tradition of Taoism, in as much as there are living lineages in some form. So that's very different than ancient Greece, which died out, right? There is no living link to ancient Greek teachings. So that's all I have to say about that.
Yeah. I guess the last thing is like, what, because I also, I did read Campbell and the type of thought that was spawned from that, and I was thinking like, it's kind of when he does all this big, and he has this big hero's journey kind of theory, it's kind of like only a or a sociologically focused approach, where it's saying like, how does myth help the society do certain things? So it's kind of like taking myth as instrumental is his idea. Would you say that's kind of correct? Like his analysis.
I completely do. And that came out, I don't know if you saw those programs. They're probably out there on YouTube and elsewhere by now. But I remember watching some of the episodes. And this came out in the book version also, which was called The Power of Myth. He was so impressed with George Lucas's Star Wars. Right? And he thought that this was a modern myth, and this was a great myth for modern people. Now, I don't know, some people have said, and I haven't looked into this, I'm not that interested to research this, but apparently George Lucas had some direct influence by by Campbell, either through encountering his writings or even meeting him, and benefiting from his his insights and perhaps counsel in the screenplay, in the script, and so forth. But if you actually watch Star Wars, and I kind of like the originals, especially the first one, the actual name, the film that had that name, Star Wars, and it's very clear that there's a kind of Obi-Wan Kenobi is a Sufi master. Or if you don't like that, you could say Obi-Wan Kenobi is a Zen master, in the sense that he's a sword master. He's very much like, maybe he's a Miyamoto Musashi or something, from the Japanese tradition, or, I don't know. I really don't know if Lucas looked into these people, but in as much as he is a man who is following the way of the sword, and there's a kind of Bushido code, isn't there? The way of the warrior, the Jedi Knight, the way of the Force, right? So there's very much personified in certain sword masters in the history of Japan, people like Yamaoka Teshu, and in the modern period, Omori Sogen, who was also a Zen priest. And there's a kind of Kshatriya dimension as well. So you can see those elements in the original Star Wars, but in the final analysis, it's just a film. It was made to entertain people and to make money for the person who filmed, who made it. So there's no sort of transcendent dimension that, you can't take Star Wars as a scripture, can you? Or as an actual traditional teaching. But Campbell, Campbell really seems to see that it has that kind of potential as a myth that modern people can live by. I don't know if you agree with me. You laughed several times quite heartily.
Yeah, no, I was just thinking that it's kind of a, that I think well, at least I hope he was not taking it literally like that, so literally as this. Sorry, a bit of noise. I hope he was not. I know what you mean, but I was just laughing because that type of kind of exaggeration has kind of, or is one culprit of kind of overall degeneration that Evola talks about, in some of the other essays, where it's like taking in a sense, when Campbell does his broad analysis of those myths and he says, oh, this form is analogous to that, then he is kind of reducing the status of what a symbol means. So then you can fill in the blank of a symbol with something like Star Wars, but he's that's not the right way to view it. Basically, that's the taking the it's it the idea of symbol has gone too far if you can replace it with whatever, basically.
Yeah, that's true. So yeah, I think that modern people really don't have an understanding of myth. And you see that also, he doesn't really get into this too much at all, really directly. But if you just look at the way that the word is used in modern English, I mean the word myth, right? They might say that, well, if you want to dismiss some kind of an idea, say, oh, that's just a myth, right? Whether that be a historical idea or some other kind of idea, if you just want to dismiss, oh, that's just a myth. These are myths, meaning it's just false. It's fiction. It doesn't really have the character of hard facts, right? And of course, the gold standard for hard facts is science and the scientific method. And the same applies to symbolism. Symbolism and the word symbol are also just profane. And you see this, for example, and symbol is at best, it's the reign of quantity, right? So the corporate logos, they have maybe some kind of symbolism, but that's about it. But if you really want to say that no, symbols have a very deep and profound meaning, or if you want to say, I'll give you a very good concrete example, concrete in the sense that there's a whole text and there is evidence that can be adduced from the ancient commentary tradition to defend my contention, and that is, if you look at geometry And if you look at the premier book of geometry, which is the Elements of Euclid, geometry, and this is something very important for René Guénon, was a subject which certainly had its practical applications in architecture, engineering, etc. But it also is a profoundly symbolic science, which is ideally suited for the symbolic and analogical communication of exceedingly recondite metaphysical truths. And if you actually look at the culmination of Euclid's Elements, it culminates with the study of the Platonic solids. And the most important of these Platonic solids is the dodecahedron. So the ancients, the Platonists or the Neoplatonists, saw the study of Euclid's Elements and the study of mathematics, very Pythagorean way, as a training that led to very profound esoteric doctrines. And this is made clear by Proclus in his commentary on Euclid's Elements. But nowadays, they don't have this notion that there's a deep symbolism in the circle, for example, or in the sphere, or in the dodecahedron, or the cube, or the movement from cube to sphere or hemisphere. All of these things were extremely important in ancient mathematics and ancient geometry, but now they are just reduced to, at best, just practical applications in science and engineering. And that's it. So I think that's a very important example of how there's a complete loss of symbolism. And just another example, I forget now which of the dialogues of Plato it is now, but I mean, of course, it's very much there in the Timaeus, this symbolism of mathematics. But in one of the other dialogues, Socrates talks about how the universe is he talks about 12 duodenaries, and if I'm not mistaken, I think there's a kind of allusion to the notion of the dodecahedron, because there's 12 signs of the zodiac, you see, and so there is a profound symbolism here, and you find that also in Pythagoras. You find that in ancient arithmetic and treatises like the Theology of Arithmetic. There was such a treatise, but all of this has been either forgotten or neglected, or is no longer discussed or talked about. If you really want to look for it, you can find it. It's a lot easier now because of the World Wide Web. Before, you needed to have access to a huge library like the library of Princeton University or Harvard or Oxford, or the libraries of Oxford University or something like this. But now a lot of this stuff is much, much more accessible. There are websites, there are people who are talking about it, there's Reddits and subreddits and so on and so on and so on, YouTube. But for the most part, it's forgotten and it's not understood. And it's certainly not taught in high school or university. You have to find it yourself.
Yeah, I think that's great. I think that's another just great example of what he's talking about, where it applies truth and myth and symbols all go together. So math and this metaphysical kind of thinking going together is just another great example of it. So yeah.
Yeah, there's another really interesting author. I would say he's a traditionalist. He's a very peculiar fellow, though, and his books are not very accessible. And he wrote his most important book is this huge 2-volume book on the study devoted to the Temple of Luxor. His name was Schwaller de Lubicz. De Lubicz is D-E, small d-e, then a space, capital L-U-B-I-C-Z, or Z. Schwaller. Schwaller is S-C-H-W-A-L-L-E-R. So he devoted his life to the interpretation of the symbolism of ancient Egypt. And he lived in Egypt on site at the Temple of Luxor in Upper Egypt, which is in the south, for something like 3 decades, and studied the entire Temple of Luxor and wrote a massive book in French called Le Temple de l'Homme, or The Temple in Man. And it's published in 2 very large volumes by Inner Traditions International. It's an expensive book, but it is a very profound book in which he talks about the microcosm, the macrocosm, ancient Egyptian science and symbolism, and ancient Egyptian mythology, its mathematical dimensions. It's really a very serious work. And interestingly enough, there is a similar work by a German scholar. I forget her first name. I think Stella Kramarisch, which is about the Hindu temple. And it's also in 2 volumes, and it studies the whole sacred geometry of ancient Hindu temple architecture. So on the one hand, Kramarisch is studying something which is still alive in some form anyway in India. And Delubish's work is just as important, but in some ways more important, because his is a work of reconstruction, meticulous and painstaking reconstruction. But these are 2 works which stand out as profound examples, very detailed studies of the centrality of symbolism and myth for ancient people, and how it really was the whole principle of their civilization, their art, their music, their medicine, architecture. And it shows just what a huge gulf or chasm separates the world of tradition and that of the moderns.
Definitely, yeah.
Had you heard of either of those books?
Oh no, I hadn't heard of it, but definitely sounds like an interesting subject, because the construction of temples in every religion
Yeah,
does follow those tendencies. Has an idea of this kind of thing.
absolutely right. There's a world of difference, between a sacred building and a profane one. I mean, just walk around, downtown New York or Chicago or London, and these places, in these major modern metropolises. There's just no comparison. It doesn't matter where you go. I mean, if you stand in a Shinto temple or a Buddhist temple in Japan, for example. I went to Japan several times, and there was, I think back in 2001, I went to Koyasan for the first time in Wakayama Prefecture in southern Japan, main island of Honshu. And it's just a beautiful city, temple city, very very small, on the top of this mountain, in a mountainous region. And it's the headquarters of Shingon Buddhism, and some of these temples are not in really great shape. I mean, that's also kind of part of the Japanese aesthetic. Their counterparts in China would have been, for the Japanese aesthetic, maybe painted with very garish or gaudy colors like red, bright reds and things. So some of these temples hadn't been painted, and the wood was just sort of decayed and so forth, but they were absolutely fantastic. So this kind of splendor and decay and nature, the Japanese notion of wabi-sabi maybe is at work there. But my point is that even a humble temple like that, or even one which was fully maintained, had a completely different vibe, to use a very modern term. A very different, more refined term would be ambiance, than any modern building. Even these attempts at copying ancient sort of architecture in Washington, D.C., the Jefferson Memorial, the Washington Memorial, they don't have that ambiance at all. I don't know if you've been to those American national monuments at all. They look very impressive from far away, but they do not have in any way a sacred ambiance. On the contrary, there's a kind of Prometheanism or a kind of Titanesque humanism about those buildings. So there's a dimension of. Do you have anything further to say on any of this?
No, yeah, I think that's a great conclusion to the essay. Yeah.
Okay. So,
No, I mean, yeah, like I definitely agree with what you said about like the feeling and to it goes well with the other essay about civilizations of time, and he talks about architecture
yeah.
there. So I think that's a nice way to connect it too as well.
Yeah, and it also is a nice way to lead into the notion of the modern taste for vulgarity, which is chapter 9's essay 9, the next one we are to discuss today. Because there definitely is a kind of visual vulgarity in modern architecture and in the modern built environment, although he does not address that in this essay. In this essay, he identifies many instances of vulgarity. He begins with some forms of literary realism, so vulgarity in modern literature, vulgarity of speech, vulgar dress, vulgar music, vulgarity in figurative art. He goes on that for a while. Vulgarity in dance. And then finally, he turns to the sphere of pornography. I should point out here, he means in the literal sense, in other words, risque or salacious writing, as opposed to more modern visual forms of the latter, and the dimension of obscenity and sadism among the moderns. So this taste for vulgarity is another manifestation of the entropic forces and tendencies of the Kali Yuga. He begins the essay, page 97, opening paragraph. The regressive processes I have repeatedly clarified in the previous pages have also had an impact on the general domain of social mores and tastes. One of the most typical indicators of this is the taste for vulgarity and its more or less subconscious background, which is constituted by the enjoyment of degradation and self-contamination, a certain tendency towards deformation, and a taste for the ugly and base is related to this. A few considerations on the matter might be of interest. So he refers to certain forms of modern literary realism, and he singles out the subject matter, hence the notion of realism, in as much as in this form of literature, there is a fascination in terms of its subject matter with whatever is most vulgar, wretched, dirty, or squalid in society. He says that a real effort is shown in this direction, to the point that the expression engaged literature is often used to describe the authors from this current, who combine their choice of such subjects with the specific aims of socio-political agitation. So this is not his main topic. He's just mentioning this in passing. And he also notes that the authors of this kind of vulgar, wretched, dirty, and squalid subject matters of literary realism are often not from those lower, wretched, and squalid classes, which manifest the phenomenon in question, but rather they are usually members of the bourgeoisie or even of the high bourgeoisie, and have various, as he calls it, intellectual pretensions. He says that they find pleasure in exploring what is base, and they feel an unhealthy attraction for what is inferior, for the subhuman, the infrahuman. All of this is, again, an aspect of regression, isn't it? So then he, having noted that, he turns to the vulgar manner of speaking. Now, this is related also, I think, to the decay of words. So in that essay on the decay of words, he wasn't really focusing on any dimension of vulgarity, but just the decline in the traditional understanding of certain key terms of Latin origin, since he's writing in Italian originally. But I think that this is also a dimension, because not only is vulgarity very much a part of modern speech, but also the level of discourse has fallen tremendously. And I think that those two go hand in hand, although Evola doesn't say this. So he's talking about a vulgar manner of speech. It's not just the use of expletives and obscenities, but also speaking in the manner of maybe lower classes. This has become so common. In other words, the vulgar manner of speech has become so common that people have few scruples to resort to it, not only in novels and short stories, but even on the radio and television. The observation just made also applies to this kind of phenomenon. Given that such speech does not belong to one's class and social milieu, and given that now young people, young women, and even elderly men from the middle classes, the haute bourgeoisie, the high bourgeoisie, or even certain segments of the aristocracy, believe that they are showing open-mindedness, freedom, and modernness by ostentatiously using this language. So this very fact for Evola shows the pleasure that the moderns have in self-degradation, self-abasement, and self-contamination. They revel in this descent. Remember the imagery, his analysis of skiing, this downward movement. So this pleasure in self-degradation is a very strange tendency. Taking pleasure, Evola says, in violating the proper norms and customs of speech simply means shattering all bounds or limits, exposing oneself to what lies below. Until recent times, the opposite tendency was common. Many male and female individuals from the lower classes would more or less artificially and clumsily imitate the mannerism, speech, and behavior of the upper classes. Today, people are doing the very opposite. And this is very, very true. I think it's a lot harder to see in a place like the United States of America, the phenomenon that he's talking about, because the manner of speaking in the United States does not really reflect social class that much. It does in the United Kingdom even to this day. So there is a certain kind of posh English, which posh people who've had posh educations and grown up among other posh people speak. And then there is another kind, there are many other kinds of English. Part of it is regional. So if you go to the UK, you can easily distinguish an accent of someone who's from Yorkshire. And again, the lower class Yorkshire. So I think many Americans now know about this because of their fascination with the program Downton Abbey, which takes place in Yorkshire. But there are other aspects. The Cockney way of speaking is a dialect, is a very low class dialect. It used to be, the East End in London, which has now basically been taken over by Pakistanis and Polish people. So you do have this situation of a sociolinguistic kind of phenomenon, but it's very true also in other languages where there are distinct forms of speech. There's a formal form of speech, and educated people know how to speak that, and there are different forms of address based on your social status, your learning, what particular profession you may belong to. And this is very much true in something like classical Japanese, That's also very true in a much more modern language, historically speaking, like that of the Urdu language. And I remember in India and Pakistan, there was a time when the servants who were obviously from the lower class, would try and imitate the speech mannerisms clumsily, as Evola says, because they weren't educated in it, of the aristocratic feudal landowners, for example. And these aristocratic feudal landowners would never among themselves speak in the manner of the lower classes. Sometimes they might have to adopt certain speech patterns in order to be understood when addressing someone from that lower class. But otherwise, it was never something to be used among themselves. And if you spoke that way in the house, the elders would always rebuke you. And there was also elements of pronunciation because the lower classes did not pronounce things properly. And so all of this was still very much a part of society in India up until the British period, up until the early period of so-called Indian independence. So this is very, very interesting and true observation that he has made. But now it's completely the other way around. And part of this has to do, again, with modern forms of propaganda and social engineering, which are usually affected through entertainment and media. And in the context of India, there was a film which came out in the 1970s called Sholay, which means flames. And in that, there is a criminal kind of warlord character. And, really for the first time in Indian cinema, all he does is use almost in every sentence obscenities and expletives. The most sort of explicit kind of insults that you could use in the Urdu language, very much akin to the English F word. So until recent times, also these kinds of words were not uttered on for example, on American television or movies. And then there was a rating system, but now it's just all sort of very common on HBO or Showtime or Netflix. And maybe they'll say something, they'll be like some cursory nonsense, language, violence, sex, nudity, or something like that. All aspects of vulgarity in one way or another. But no one really thinks about it anymore. And it's just taken as normal. So all of this is, again, a manifestation and reflection of this reveling in self-degradation, self-abasement, and self-contamination. So much for language. Then he turns to vulgarity in dress. Again, this is something which I think a lot of modern people don't really have a problem with. He says, in this connection is worth mentioning a related phenomenon, namely that of the taste for the ugly, vulgar, and shabby in one's way of dressing, which has even become fashionable in certain milieus. Workers' or cyclists' jerseys, peasants' overcoats and trousers, untucked knotted shirts, and so on. This is very common in the United States of America. I remember when I was a child in the US, there were still people, they would go out, if they were in university, they would wear a jacket and a tie. There would be long sleeves, there would be dress pants and dress shoes. It wasn't until I went to university much later. When I started college, it was late 1980s. And I was shocked when one of the professors came to class wearing shorts. He's just wearing shorts and it looked like he'd just gotten up from his bed. He had some disheveled hair, and I'm just comes in there and begins lecturing on chemistry or physics, whatever it is. I don't remember what the topic was. But there was a time where a proper American housewife would not even go to the supermarket until she properly dressed up, had done her hair, put on some sort of makeup, would go out in a dress with proper shoes and have a purse. Not anymore. So all of this has completely and totally changed. And interestingly enough, Evola is very much against blue jeans. So he says, these find their counterparts in long unkempt hair and in the uncouth coarse manners and attitudes that these loutish youths have learned from American films, with their whiskey shots and double gin. Most remarkable of all for Evola is the still partly ongoing trend among young or even married women of wearing blue jeans, which is to say work trousers. So he's very much against blue jeans, not only because they, in his view, are not proper for the female form, but also in as much as they are work clothes, clothes of the lower classes, of laborers, of the proletarians, the Shudras. So he would be equally against men wearing blue jeans. Yeah, he's very upset about it. He says that the passiveness and tolerance exhibited by men in this respect is truly astonishing. These girls ought to have been sent to, his words, concentration or labor camps. These, and not luxurious existentialist apartments, would have been the appropriate setting for them and for their functionality of their way of dressing, and might even have ensured a salutary re-education. Very strong words from Evola. With those remarks, he advances then into the area of vulgarity in music. So I really don't know what he's referring to. This is some maybe kind of singing in Italy, and it's explained in the footnote. He says, in a different field, the fad of howling singers, which unfortunately is widespread in Italy, is another expression of this taste for the vulgar. Yeah, so whatever that meant in Italy at that time. So let's leave that aside. And then he says, this notion of coming down. He says, one enjoys stepping down onto the level of the street, the alleyway, the corner market in this form of singing. There's a regressivism, the primitivism, he calls it, of a coarse voice. In the best of cases, an almost animal-like instinctiveness in the field of self-expression and emotion. The ecstasy that for some time now the hoarse and ungraceful singing of the Negro has been inducing in men and women of the white race reflects the same tendency. In the period of this writing, the band known as the Beatles, who have filled the youth with delirious enthusiasm, forms a particular case. Leaving aside their hairdos, which match the description I've already given, the very name they have chosen for themselves is revealing. These shouters have chosen as their symbol one of the most disgusting insects, which once again perfectly illustrates the pleasure of abjection. So at the root of all of this is this demonic fascination with, what he called dark ecstasies in the previous essay on irrationality. He says that what lies at the basis, as he's already said, what lies at the basis of these and other phenomena is the pleasure of stooping to a lower level. Now he makes a very provocative remark here. He says this is the same sort of pleasure, this idea of stooping to a lower level. This is the same sort of pleasure that in the sexological field distinguishes masochism and self-sadism. In terms of depth psychology, Evola says, we're dealing here with a destructive tendency directed against oneself. So he definitely sees some kind of a manifestation of a guilt complex in this behavior, this reveling in self-abasement and abjection. He says it is as though one had perceived one's failure to live up to oneself, that one had perceived that foregoing of any higher meaning of life which characterizes the modern age, and had felt, as a counterpart, an obscure sense of guilt or betrayal. It is as though one found pleasure in degrading, damaging, and contaminating oneself. If I would like to offer my own observations on some aspects of popular culture here, we find this fascination manifested in modern TV programs and films quite a bit, in that everybody almost there's no TV characters or film characters which embody a heroic ideal. They'll talk about heroes and superheroes, but no, there's no, the Evolian sense, the traditional sense of a heroic ideal. You never have, or it's very rare. The norm has become that every TV character is living beneath themselves. They're all fundamentally flawed. They're all morally compromised. We see this, for example, in the glorification of crime, criminals, and criminality. Films about that glorify bank heists, for example. That's a whole genre now almost. Or gratuitous violence in the form of the action film. A fascination with dark and demonic forces in horror movies, for example. This fascination with the demonic. A fascination with gratuitous violence. Films like Saw. A fascination with serial killers. There are many films based on serial killers. Real dramatizations based on actual killers, or completely fictional ones like the Hannibal Lecter series of films, for example. So this kind of vulgarity is very much there, and it is as though everyone has said, in terms of this guilt complex, that everybody's pretty much basically evil. What the hell, let's all just forget it. There is no real need to transcend oneself. There's really no need to do the right thing. And we find this across many modern serials, TV series and films. And there's even a kind of attempt to sort of justify, as in, for example, the very successful series Breaking Bad, which is a story about this chemistry teacher who is really quite brilliant, but he didn't get a faculty position or whatever, and so he's teaching high school chemistry. He finds out he has cancer. His son has some sort of developmental problems. He has many financial issues, so he decides to start cooking crystal meth. And then, of course, that's the first step on the slippery slope, and he just becomes transformed into a complete and total criminal, or you could say he was one from the beginning. But everyone in that series, everybody in that show, every single character is completely and totally morally compromised. None of them is aspiring for any kind of a higher ideal of transcendence at all. And that's just one example. But this is this pleasure, this reveling in the pursuit of self-degradation, self-contamination, and self-abasement is very much there across all dimensions of modern American popular culture and across the board. Most people are consumers of American popular culture. So this tendency towards sadism, which he has just introduced, he elaborates further, saying on page 101, in general terms, the sadistic tendency also manifests itself in one aspect of the kind of art and literature which enjoys highlighting those human types and situations that reflect a shattered, broken down, or corrupt mankind. So what I just said, for example, Breaking Bad, Call Saul is another show like that. You can just think of any number of examples. And this is very different. So, for example, there's a modern serial that comes from Turkey. It has no real basis at all in historical fact, but it's a so-called historical drama. It's called Resurrection Ertuğrul, or in Turkish, Diriliş Ertuğrul, on Netflix. And it's a very, very mythological, I use this in the modern sense, maybe I should say fictional in the light of the essay that we just discussed before, a fictionalized account of the founder of the Ottoman Empire. But in that serial, this man is truly a heroic individual. He's always aspiring to better himself, to do the right thing, to sacrifice for people, to give his life, to fight on the battlefield. There are people in this drama who are flawed and who make the wrong moral choices, but they always come to bad ends, or they repent. It's very different. You don't have that really in modern kind of popular culture. So that's an interesting exception. And yeah, I don't know if you've heard of this, but it's been fabulously successful in the Islamic world. It was released with Arabic subtitles. It's been dubbed into Urdu, and there's a whole sort of suffice it to say, it has a cult following, but it's very different from the kind of things which you would find in the modern world. So this kind of fascination he characterizes by the German term Schadenfreude, if I've pronounced it correctly. In other words, a kind of vicarious kind of bizarre pleasure in acts of malfeasance. He calls it a malicious pleasure, which is to say, Evola says, a kind of sadism, a sadistic enjoyment. One enjoys gazing not at the upright man, but at the falling, failed, or degenerate man, the lower, not higher limit of the human condition. To some extent, one might also refer here to what I will argue with regard to the laughter of the gods. That's in another essay. In the past, Evola says, Jewish and Russian writers were particularly active in this sense. Nowadays, it has become a general trend. I'm not really sure who he's referring to. By Russian, does he mean Dostoevsky? Does he mean? I really don't know. And there's no the editor translator has not provided us with any scholarly footnotes or glosses in this regard. So I don't know if anyone can shed light on that. Please do so in the discussion. All right, so there's also vulgarity in figurative art. This is a big one for Evola. Here too, he says, interpreters and critics have invoked various pretexts. They speak of an existential revolt as the meaning of these displays, and in some cases, the socio-political motives of engagé left-wing intellectuals also come into play. Now, there's a very interesting remark after that. He refers to an important thinker from the Frankfurt School, a Jewish thinker, Theodor W. Adorno. Now, he's associated with the Frankfurt School. He came to the United States along with other members of the Frankfurt School, and he's very, very influential. He had many writings. He wrote on fascism. He developed something called the F scale. Thinkers on the right identify him as one of the leading figures in what they term cultural Marxism. But Adorno was trained as a musicologist, and he was interested also in something called atonal music, and he tried to describe atonal music in these terms of a kind of socio-political motive, apparently, according to Evola. And he wrote about this in something called Philosophy of Modern Music. He also has a book against astrology. He's a very prolific person. And there is a peculiar or odd kind of allegation or contention, for which I have never seen any actual documentary evidence, but it is a very widely disseminated contention on the internet, a claim that Adorno was actually the person who was really behind the Beatles, as you mentioned the Beatles earlier, and that he apparently held the rights to the Beatles songs and was, responsible for promoting this kind of music for very nefarious ends. But I have never seen any actual documentation that would establish that Adorno held the copyright for the Beatles lyrics, or that he composed their music or had any direct connection with the Beatles at all. It's just a claim that is made here and there. And I often wonder about that. But it's interesting that he comes up in this essay where the Beatles have also made an appearance. So in a well-known work on the philosophy of modern music, Theodor W. Adorno has sought to interpret atonal music precisely in such terms. And then there's a colon, namely, the inrush of sounds shattering traditional harmony and rebelling against the canon of the harmonic triad is seen as the counterpart of the existential revolt against the false ideals and conventions of bourgeois and capitalist society. You have to remember that Adorno is some sort of a Marxist. However, Evola says, in this case, we must be careful not to oversimplify things. In order to make an assessment, it is necessary to take the whole range of possible orientations into account. So he talks more about modern forms of music and vulgarity in music in his book, Ride the Tiger, part 6, chapter 23. So I think many modern people would find this notion of vulgarity in music also something very challenging for them to understand or accept. But it's a very old and ancient idea. If you, again, study Plato, there were certain kinds of music and certain kinds of scales, or sorry, not scales, modes, that they talked about in ancient music theory, and Plato was aware of these, and certain modes were forbidden, and forbidden in his ideal city, which he talks about in the Republic, that so certain kinds of music would not be allowed. So he says yes, that he talks about this more in Ride the Tiger. He also references another writer who I'd never heard of before I read Evola, someone named John Hemming Fry, who wrote a book, he says, in the interwar period. So that means between World War I and World War II, entitled The Revolt Against Beauty, in which he talks about the, and I quote, deformations, distortions, and primitivism that play a significant role in many contemporary works of figurative art, both painting and sculpture. In some cases, elective affinities, writes Evola, with the art of savages and Negroes, according to Evola, constitute an additional and most eloquent indicator. There's a footnote by Evola here. It says, it is important to note that authentic Negro and primitive works have nothing to do with the adoption of a particular artistic style. More often, deformations and distortions form part of a magical art which is based not on the subjective imagination, but on the actual perception of dark elementary forces. So here again, we see the peculiar doctrines of race which Evola upheld in his writings, in which he identifies the black race, to whom he refers to as Negroes, as personifications or manifestations of these kind of lower and chthonic tendencies, and he sees that this is very much there in the figurative art associated with the black races of Africa as well. All right, so after all of that, I think Evola does make these are all indications. He's dealing with particularities, more or less. He hasn't really espoused any sort of explicitly espoused any kind of universal principles. Obviously, behind all of this, again, is the notion of the regression of castes, the loss of hierarchy, heroic ideals, warrior ideals, Olympian ideals, Uranic vision. That's very much what is behind all of this. But here he makes an important point of a more universal character. He says that we shouldn't talk about beauty in academic terms, sort of pedantic, erudite, kind of characterizations of beauty, which we might find among these kind of excessively rationalistic scholars. He says, rather, we should refer to the opposition between form and formlessness. The idea that any genuine creative process consists in the predominance of form over the formless, in terms of the Greek idea of the transition from chaos to cosmos. Remember how In an earlier essay, he talked about how this transition from chaos to cosmos is so important and is truly the basis of all the ancient mythologies of traditional man. And that transition from chaos to cosmos necessitates the imposition of limits. Otherwise, there would be no order coming forth from chaos. And so again, there is this notion of hierarchy. And I think that sentence there is really important and is kind of and really is the key to understanding the principle or principles that underlie the observations or the views which he has expressed about different instances of vulgarity in the modern age. In a higher sense, he continues, acknowledged not just by classical authors, but even by Nietzsche, beauty corresponds to complete and dominant form, to style, to the law expressing the sovereignty of an idea and will. As regards the rise of the formless, chaotic, and ugly, what we find is a destructive process, not power, but impotence. This phenomenon has a regressive character. Psychologically, the background is always the same, a sadistic tendency, a taste for contamination on the part of the artist and those who appreciate and enjoy this kind of art, supposing it is a matter of real taste and not a foolish reverse conformism as in most cases. Significantly, in all fairy tale or quote unquote or superstitious representations of demons, the grotesque deformation of the human figure is a predominant element, just as in the works of some of the most popular modern authors. You would also find this grotesque deformation of the human figure in the paintings of modern painters such as Picasso, for example. Now he turns to vulgarity in dance. Typically, self-sadistic traits are also presented by some very recent dances in which we no longer find merely syncopated, intense elementary rhythms. One might even find something positive in this, as I have noted elsewhere. He's referring to Ride the Tiger, again, chapter 23, but rather a grotesquely epileptic and monkey-like pattern, almost a pleasure in distorting to the utmost degree all that is noble in the human figure through violent puppet-like contortions, leaps, and convolutions. You will find this kind of dance also in some of the more chthonic traditions, where certain rites involve such dance and involve an attempt to achieve possession by demonic entities. All right, so after having made that observation on the vulgarity of dance, he has a rather extended treatment of the sphere of pornography. He says, finally, the sphere of pornography and the obscene is particularly worth taking into consideration. Heated debates also related to the problem of censorship have been raging with regard to texts regarded as obscene. He gives the example of the famous or infamous work of D.H. Lawrence known as Lady Chatterley's Lover. This was a highly controversial book. There was attempt to have it legally condemned, censored, and this is elaborated upon in the footnote at the bottom of page 104, footnote number 11. So the particular details of that case do not really concern us. In the next paragraph, Evola says, in a more general principle, he's saying that as in other countries, the law of England describes as obscene whatever can corrupt and pervert. However, it does not regard as prosecutable obscene works that are valuable for art, science, or any other field of public interest. So what is really at question here and it should be pointed out that Evola was in no sense some kind of a moralist or some kind of a person of a prudish Victorian viewpoint. He is against the notion of the making of sex into a kind of religion of itself, raising it to a level of complete and total obsession. He deals elsewhere in this volume, The Bow and the Club, about contemporary currents that extol sex and champion sexual freedom. So he makes clear what his stand is. So he's not writing from the position of Christian moralism. He says on page 105, the problem is quite another. Today it is necessary rather to take a stand against everything which serves only to trigger a sort of chronic obsession with sex and women. This is very important, because if you have this kind of obsession, that means that in a society, that society then will be dominated by women and the so-called feminine principle, which for Evola is a sign of degeneration and regression, and indeed an inversion of what the normal or normative state of affairs should be, the dominance of the male principle. So today it is rather to take a stand against everything which serves only to trigger a sort of chronic obsession with sex and women, and which ultimately represents a systematic wide-scale attack against virile values. For wherever love and sex predominate, it will always be womankind that in some way or other predominates. This obsession is nourished in 1,000 ways by means that are not strictly speaking obscene, such as the images in magazines, ads in films, beauty pageants, sexual enlightenment literature, with its scientific pretensions, female immodesty, strip teases, the display of women's underwear in shop windows, and so on. Racy novels and stories are only one particular case. It is the overall phenomenon that one ought to keep in mind in order to recognize its corrupting action, not from the standpoint of petty morals, but in the aforementioned terms, which is to say an implicit action of corrosion and attack against those interests and values that ought to remain dominant in any higher civilization. So again, Evola is affirming the principle that one must be opposed to all tendencies that glorify and revel in the pleasure of self-degradation, self-abasement, and self-contamination. However, he wishes to further examine the notions, the terms denoted by the obscene, quote unquote, and the pornographic. He does this by way of etymology, pointing out that the term pornographic comes from the Greek term porne. Now, porne in ancient Greek meant a prostitute. But in ancient Greece, there was more than one kind of prostitute. So a porne is a low class, low rank prostitute as opposed to a ḥāʾirī. Ḥāṭīra is something more like a courtesan, maybe something like what you would find in Japan in the form of the geisha, or also the kind of courtesans which you found in the period of Mughal decline in northern India, for example. Hence, it would be arbitrary to apply the term to texts that do not exclusively concern low-level prostitution. Instead, the term obscene comes from the Latin caenum, meaning dirtiness, filth, and mud, or even excrement. Hence, it may be used to describe one aspect of the most recent erotic literature, which leads us back to our main topic, the taste for all that is dirty, inferior, and vulgar. So Evola is in no way some kind of a moralist, and there's just one more passage which I want to point out where he explicitly says this, and we will conclude. I thought I had underlined it, but I seem to have missed it. Well, I can't find it now, but suffice it to say that he goes out of his way to say that he is not arguing from a position of Judeo-Christian moralism or prudishness of any sort. He's simply trying to call attention to this notion of this downward and regressive movement, and that in any society where you have an obsession with sex, as for example we find in the United States today, then this is an example of a corrosive influence having gained ascendancy, a manifestation of the Kali Yuga. So he just says here on the last page of this essay, if the aforementioned justifications of obscenity are made in good faith, we must simply conclude that those who make them do not even realize the nature of the influences they are subject to, that they merely undergo them and are used by them, following an underlying current whose many manifestations all rigorously converge in a single direction. The concluding sentence: with regard to the present matter, one must speak of nothing but debasement, vulgarity, and pure degradation as essential components of the predominant taste and mores today. So this essay, maybe not Evola's most polished, he simply makes certain observations on all of these domains of culture, but he says that all of them are united by this pleasure in self-abasement, and that this is an extremely dangerous tendency. And it seems he gave the most place to pornography and obscenity, and he saw that as a particularly dangerous manifestation of the destruction of the supremacy of the heroic male and virile principle, what Evola would have called the dominance of the Purusha over Prakriti, or the how does it go in Chinese? The yang over the yin. Anyhow, so I will stop there. My lord, it's almost 9:30. But we can certainly discuss this for next 10 or 15 minutes, but I think after that I will probably have to go. So I don't think we'll get to one of the shorter essays. I think I was going to talk about what is tradition, but anyhow, let's discuss this.
Yeah, no problem at all. I think like you said, even though it's kind of like if we didn't have the background, or I guess the hermeneutic of reading Ivola's other essays, like you said, it's kind of like a list of things that he just doesn't approve of. But then I was thinking that actually this, in our modern times has or might turn out to be one of the very insightful things he's written, because so much these days there is the, I guess, as aesthetics is very related to politics these days, and you see sometimes some people try to say that those who are concerned with aesthetics are not serious politicians, while on the other hand,
good point.
While on the other hand, they're disingenuous, because it is more often than not their attempt to degrade aesthetics, like Evola's talking about, which is itself making a political point, which is to say that, basically that's it. So, for example, if there is some kind of government institution that is having some kind of policy that is very detrimental to the like contributing members of society or something. For example, in the news recently, you know, they let some criminals go a bit easier, for example. That's been something in the news in the news recently. So if person concerned with tradition or concerned with simply keeping order in society focuses on that, for example, they will quickly see a link where that leads to things like public disorder, like dirtiness on the street or something. So all I'm trying to say is that uh aesthetics can run from something like a TV show or a movie to that daily life kind of stuff. Uh so it has been a bit of discussion. Well, it has been quite a topic of discussion in recent years, which is that when someone, for example, complains like about an ugly TV show, for example, or a show that promotes immoral values, that does not mean they are distracted from politics or not serious or something. Rather, it reflects that the people who are in politics are using those means like TV shows as propaganda to promote their degraded aesthetic sensibility, or even worse, their degraded morality, which
Yeah.
is
Yeah.
so that's all in a sense to say, to summarize quickly, when this term culture war comes up in the news or something like that, sometimes disingenuous people will say, if you are concerned with culture war, you are not concerned with the most pressing issues, when in fact it's the other way around, like Evola is kind of hinting at here. To ignore aesthetics is to ignore something, one of the main manifestations of the problem. And if someone tries to dissuade you from focusing on those kind of aesthetics, they have something kind of hidden up their sleeve. They want to continue promoting this degradation, and
Degradation, yeah.
and want you to stop looking at it, basically. So that's kind of a way to read this essay that goes beyond any specific form. And the reason why he notes so many different forms that are vulgar is because of this tendency, and you linked it to the Frankfurt School, which is another these days people are catching on that that it's kind of a culprit of this kind of idea of deconstruction, or
Yeah.
cynicism towards heroics is kind of stemming from that idea, from ideas promoted by that strain of thought.
Yeah, I think that's you really eloquently summed that up very well. This notion of degraded aesthetic and degraded moral sensibility, and how pointing that out is really it's really at the heart of the political, isn't it? It's not a retreat from genuine political issues. I think there is also this idea that politics really, the main issues, especially in America, are taxes and money and the standard of living and things of this nature. Yeah, and here I think Evola would again, he talks about the demon of the economy in, I think, Men Among the Ruins, and that comes up elsewhere. And you're also quite right. If this was the first essay we had read, never having read the rest of what we read about Evola in the order that we did, it would just seem like kind of very kind of subjective proclivities of one man, right? But to be also fair to Evola, he has elaborated on many of these ideas elsewhere. For example, he gave various footnotes to Ride the Tiger, and I think his other book on the Grail, or maybe that was in the other essay. But suffice it to say, he has addressed these kind of issues elsewhere. And with his concluding thoughts on sadism and perversion and the sexological realm, his book on the yoga of power deals at some length with that dimension of human existence as also, the left-hand path, as offering a path of ascent for a certain human type, not all human types. The more alchemically dry path being spelled out in detail in his book on Buddhism, The Doctrine of Awakening. But also he has an entire book devoted to, which I think is very much a kind of indirectly, maybe he didn't write it as a polemic, but obviously it's a completely different understanding than that of Freud, and that is his book, The Metaphysics of Sex, which I think in America, the English title is Eros and the Mysteries, Eros and the Mysteries of Love, or maybe that was the original title. I don't know. But that's a full monograph length, book length treatment of that topic. So this essay is more kind of a tip of the iceberg for themes which he has developed at much more length in his more substantial works.
Yeah, and just to kind of round off or connect the this essay to the previous one, I was just thinking of this, like, you know, because you mentioned like the modern understanding of both, or like, I guess what Evola is talking about, you noticed in like Campbell when he's talking about pop culture, and like you mentioned pop culture for this one. So just to connect it, I think I think the reason, or the modern well, it's not even confusion at this point, because the writers of it are like full believers in this kind of in this kind of vulgarity use, like that he quoted some author, he quoted some author who's like trying to make excuses for vulgarity, and I think whatever mindset that is quite widespread in many pop culture creators. Yes. So in any case, it comes from, I think, the a misplaced sense of maturity or attempt to be superior, where they believe that, for example, cynicism was how people really thought, or how people always thought, and it's kind of like a overinflation of their intelligence, something like that. I think that must be at the root of it, where they think like, oh, those people, or the people who are really in charge of things, cannot possibly have believed in those myths. They knew that it was instrumental or something like that. So then when they create characters, these types of characters are also like cynical, and they don't believe in things, and I think that's the
Yeah. Your mic just went off. Were you done, or did you turn it off by accident?
Oh no, sorry. Yeah, that was just a bit of news. But yeah, I'm sorry, noise. But yes, I think that's generally I think that I'm pretty much done, and that's like, I'm pretty sure that is their mindset, where they mistake cynicism for maturity, and then impute that mindset back into either a historical setting, like even in some history, in some ways, academic historians reconstruct events sometimes reflects that too, I think, not just in pop
they
culture.
anachronistically project backward into time, into history, into the past, the conceits and prejudices of the modern mentality. That's definitely true. And just in the context of what's called cultural Marxism, it's interesting that if you type that into a search engine like Google, it will take the first hit that will come up is a Wikipedia page. And the Wikipedia page will say that this is a popular conspiracy theory among the right and the alt-right. It's very astonishing to see that, and there is actually a very well documented book, but again, it'll just be denounced by people who want to just do argumentum, engage in argumentum ad hominem without reading. But it's a very well documented and very well written book, a very large book in excess of some 400 pages, entitled The Perversion of Normality. And it came out recently, the last year or so, or maybe last 2 years. It's by someone named Kerry Bolton, who again is a controversial figure because he's one of these people on the so-called alt-right. But so what? Read the book. It's very well documented. And it's interesting that he actually begins with the Marquis de Sade and sadism. He talks about all of these figures. He talks about Adorno. He talks about Kinsey, of the Kinsey reports. Talks about many figures. Looks at the Frankfurt School. So this book, The Perversion of Normality, is a very, very interesting study. And it's very interesting also that there's a profound similarity between the kind of conditions that we find in the United States today and those which prevailed during the Weimar Republic in Germany, in terms of what Evola talked about in his as the final example in his essay, The Taste for Vulgarity. In other words, the complete societal kind of obsession with sex. So anyway, those are interesting points, I suppose. We could go on discussing this for many more hours, I suppose.
Yeah, but yeah, I think that's
there's so many examples, right?
yeah, I think that's quite quite a thorough attempt to get at what Evola is really talking about. I guess just because it's kind of like my pet well like issue or something. It's just that, I mean, certainly a lot of people listening, and you yourself know this, but it's just interesting, or maybe not, or I get more accurately revealing that the one way you can know how Evola is right in my view is that it's going through the same method of analyzing our opponent, I guess, our political opponent, or the ones who are responsible for this mode of cultural, of this mindset behind their cultural output. Because because I'm well, now I'm thinking about the historical academic historian example again, and how it's been degraded, but I think it applies to arts and pop culture as well, which is this. When they impute modern understandings or modern dogma back into historical findings, they do that at the same time as degrading tradition, or saying that their work represents a break from tradition and hailing it as a good thing. So it's kind of talking out of two sides of their mouth, where on one hand they're saying we want to get away from the old tradition, but the old tradition was exactly just like us, like modern taste. So you see a kind of dissonance there, where it's like they know that tradition is good, or people will like it if tradition, well, people look to tradition for like for so security and things to believe in. So then if they corrupt the source, then it will change people's minds. So it's moved to a kind of revisionism, instead of in like maybe the 60s era is saying like, oh, we're all new. So it's kind of more insidious of trying to change the past in that way, was what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, interesting. Well, thank you for your insights. It was quite, as always, a very interesting discussion, and let's just pick this up tomorrow.
Yeah,
I think we'll just go with the essay on initiation,
yes,
and then see if we can get to anything else, because I think initiation is so important for Evola, and it was extremely important for Guénon, and it's important for all of the people who may be classified as traditionalists with a capital T. And there are some controversies here as well on initiation. And we began this whole series of lectures or discussions with Evola and his indebtedness to René Guénon, and we discussed at length his essay on René Guénon, A Master for Our Times. But he differed with Guénon on a number of things. And one of the most crucial of those, of course, the first one is, I suppose I'd say the first is his idea that it was really the philosopher king, or the combination of the Kshatriya and the Brahmin in one person, which Guénon didn't uphold. He held that in primordial times it was the sacerdotalium, or the priestly class that was at the apex. And then the other area where they differ is on exactly what is understood by initiation and how necessary initiation is. And there were kind of group of doctrinaire Guénonians that emerged in Italy while Evola was still alive, and they denounced him for certain of his ideas. And they were sort of kind of Evola characterized them as fostering a kind of scholasticism of Guénon or something. And that, unless you were an Orthodox Guénonian in the way that they understood Guénon, then you were a deviant, and so on and so forth. So there were some controversies there as well, especially on the nature of initiation. And that's, what did I do with, where did that go? Well, Ride the Tiger, so that book is very different in terms of, he's sort of even dispensing with the whole idea of initiation, but he did not reject initiation. So exactly what his views are extremely important, I think, for a proper understanding of traditionalism. And so we'll just pick that up from our next time.
Yeah,
So,
definitely. All right.
great.
Great.
All right. Well, thank you so much. Have a good night. We'll see you tomorrow. Same time.
All right. Yep.
All
See
right
you.
then. Bye.
Bye.